Hi guys, welcome back to K-Drama Addict.
The Midlands had a way of healing things quietly. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movies where a single sunrise changes everything and the protagonist walks out of their front door a completely different person. No, the Midlands healed the way soil works, slowly and from underneath, in increments so small you only notice the change when you look back at where you were 6 months ago and realize you can no longer quite remember what that level of pain felt like from the inside. It had been a year since Naledi and Junho had landed in Johannesburg. A year since she had stepped off that plane and felt the high-felt air and let something in her chest unclench for the first time in 3 years. A year of mornings with 2 mugs and a garden view and a succulent named Mike too who was, against all reasonable expectation, thriving. They had bought the house in the Midlands outright 6 months after arriving. It was not the kind of house that announced itself. No grand gates, no imported marble, no architecture designed to communicate wealth to passers-by the way the Choi family home in Gangnam had been. It was a long, low farmhouse with thick walls and wooden ceilings and a wraparound stoop that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything look golden from 3 o'clock onward. The garden was large and slightly wild because Naledi had decided she was done with manicured things. She wanted something that grew, according to its own logic. She planted lavender and indigenous grasses and a small vegetable patch that Junho tended with the earnest dedication of a man who had never grown anything before and was now personally offended by every tomato that didn't make it. "The problem," he said one morning, crouching over his tomato plants with an expression of deep professional concern, "is that these ones in the corner are not getting enough afternoon sun." Naledi looked up from her coffee. "Junho, you run a multinational investment portfolio. And these tomatoes need afternoon sun." She laughed. She laughed easily these days, not the way she had laughed in Seoul, which had always carried a slight alertness, a slight awareness of the room, the slight performance of a woman who was always being watched and assessed. She laughed the way she had laughed before Seoul. The full version. The one that used her whole face. Liam's Light had launched officially 4 months after their arrival, and it had grown faster than either of them had planned for. The literacy program now ran in 11 schools across KwaZulu-Natal, providing books, trained reading facilitators, and an after-school program that had, in its first year, raised the average reading level of participating students by nearly 2 full grades. The Department of Basic Education had taken notice. A meeting had been requested. A potential partnership was on the table that could expand the foundation's reach to 3 additional provinces. Naledi ran the foundation, not as a patron, not as a figurehead wife who lent her name and her photograph to a cause while someone else did the actual work. She ran it strategy, operations, partnerships, curriculum design, donor relationships. She was in schools twice a week and in meetings the other days and on her laptop at the kitchen table most evenings. And she had not been this fully herself professionally since before she had moved to Seoul and quieted herself to fit into a life that was always slightly too small for who she was. Junho had restructured his business interests significantly. He maintained his investment portfolio. He was still, technically, a billionaire, though he wore it differently now, more carefully, without the apparatus of display that had surrounded his life in Seoul. He had established a South African office, hired a small local team, and was actively investing in manufacturing and infrastructure projects on the continent. He had, in the past year, learned conversational Zulu with the same methodical determination he applied to everything, and the first time he greeted Naledi's mother in her own language, she had pressed both hands to her cheeks and laughed until she cried. His mother-in-law, his real mother-in-law, the one who had flown from Durban at 2 in the morning when her daughter needed her, the one who had sent money she could not entirely afford and told her daughter that bangles given with love could be spent with love, had visited 3 times in the past year and showed no signs of reducing the frequency. She had claimed the second bedroom as hers in all but official documentation. She had strong opinions about Junho's tomato management and had taken it upon herself to intervene directly, which meant that the tomatoes were now doing significantly better. "Your mother pruned my plants," Junho told Naledi one evening, gesturing toward the garden with his wine glass. "She pruned you too," Naledi said. "You're doing much better as well." He considered this and then nodded seriously. "This is fair." They talked about Liam every Sunday. It was a practice they had established deliberately. A weekly ritual of remembrance that sat alongside their grief, rather than trying to dissolve it. They would sit on the deck with their morning tea and take turns. One memory each, sometimes funny, sometimes unbearably tender, always true. The comic books, the thunder, Mike the succulent, The way he had. To teach his father a township handshake, he had learned from a video and had practiced the whole thing wrong and been completely unbothered when informed of this. The way he said mama when he was tired, dropping the second syllable slightly, a baby word he had never quite grown out of, and that Naledi was grateful for every single time she remembered it. The grief did not go away. She did not expect it to. But it had changed shape, from something that ambushed her constantly to something she had learned to carry, something with weight but also with warmth, a reminder that she had loved enormously and been loved enormously, and that her son had lived, however briefly, entirely surrounded by that love. It was on a warm Thursday evening, almost exactly a year after they had arrived, that Junho came home from his office in Johannesburg with a particular expression on his face. Not worried exactly. Thoughtful in a way that had a slight edge to it. What? Naledi said, looking up from her laptop. He set his keys down, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen counter. I had a call today, he said, from my sister's husband. Naledi set her laptop aside. He wanted to discuss a business opportunity. Junho said the last two words with a careful neutrality that communicated a great deal. He said he was calling on behalf of the family. What family? Junho looked at her. My family. Seoul. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening birds were doing their last rounds over the garden, and the light had gone that deep amber that preceded the Midlands dusk. What did you say? Naledi asked. I said I would think about it, Junho said. Which I have now done. He put his water glass down. And my answer is no. Naledi nodded slowly. Is everything okay over there? Did he say? He mentioned some cash flow challenges. The careful neutrality again. He was not specific. She looked at her husband, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes and the particular quality of stillness that settled over him when he had made a decision from his core rather than from his circumstances. And she understood that this was not the last call they would receive from Seoul. That whatever was happening over there was the beginning of something, not the end. That the life they had built here, this quiet golden farmhouse life with tomatoes and Mike 2 and Sunday memories and a foundation that was changing children's futures, was about to be tested in a new way. She reached across the kitchen counter and put her hand over his. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. Outside, the last of the amber light faded over the Midlands hills, and the evening settled in warm and unhurried, and neither of them knew yet the full extent of what was unraveling on the other side of the world. But they were, for the first time in a long time, facing the same direction. Together, on solid ground. The Choi family home in Gangnam had always been a statement. Madame Choi had understood instinctively, from the very beginning of her ascent into wealth, that money was only half the language of the rich. The other half was visibility. You had to be seen to be wealthy in the right ways, at the right events, wearing the right things, surrounded by the right people, or the money itself meant nothing because no one knew to envy you for it. She had built her life around this principle with the same discipline other women applied to careers or families, and she had been, by every external measure, extraordinarily successful at it. Her wardrobe alone was a financial ecosystem. She had pieces from every major European house, Chanel, Dior, Givenchy, Valentino, Balenciaga. She had a Hermes collection that took up an entire room of the house. Bags arranged in their dust bags on custom-built shelves, organized by color and season and occasion. She had jewelry for morning and jewelry for evening and jewelry for the specific category of afternoon event that required something between the two. She had shoes in quantities that required an inventory spreadsheet maintained by her personal assistant. A young woman named Yuna who had learned early in her employment that Madame Choi's footwear was to be treated with the seriousness of a museum collection. After Junho left Seoul, Madame Choi had not reduced any of this. If anything, she had accelerated it. There had been a period, in the months immediately following her son's departure, when she had felt the first faint tremors of something she refused to name as fear. Junho had been the operational center of the Choi business empire since his late 20s. Not just as an investor and decision-maker, but as the person who actually understood the structure of things, who read the reports and questioned the numbers and made the calls that kept the various holdings moving in the right direction. His departure had left a gap that the family had assumed could be filled easily and had discovered, somewhat gradually and then very suddenly, could not. His younger sister, Choi Soo-yeon, had stepped into the role. Soo-yeon was 32, beautiful, charming, and entirely unsuited to the demands of running a diversified holding company. This was not a personal failing so much as a structural one. She had never been trained for it, had never been expected to do it, had spent her adult life moving between social events and design projects in a brief, enthusiastic foray into launching a luxury skincare brand that had been propped up by family money and had not, upon close inspection, ever made a profit. She had the family's confidence and her mother's blessing and an absolute certainty in her own judgment that was entirely uncorrelated with her actual track record. She hired new advisors, younger, more fashionable, less experienced. She dismissed 2 of the senior managers who had been with the company for over a decade on the grounds that they were too conservative and did not understand her vision. She made several large investments in sectors she found aesthetically interesting without adequate due diligence. She approved a significant renovation of the company's headquarters building, new interiors, new branding, an art installation in the lobby that cost more than a small apartment, because she felt the existing space did not communicate the right image. She also, quietly and then less quietly, began drawing from the company accounts at a rate that the remaining financial staff found alarming but felt unable to challenge given her authority and her mother's backing. Madame Choi, for her part, had not slowed down either. The charity gala circuit had become her primary occupation. There were events every week, sometimes multiple events in a single week, and each one required a new outfit because appearing in the same ensemble twice in a season was, in her social world, a form of public humiliation she simply would not accept. She had taken to traveling for fashion, Paris for the shows, Milan for private appointments, New York for what she called cultural balance but which primarily involved shopping on Fifth Avenue and dinners at restaurants where the waiting list was a status symbol in itself. She had hired a second personal assistant specifically to manage her travel schedule. She had expanded her beauty regime to include treatments available only at a clinic in Switzerland, which she visited quarterly. She had decided, after seeing a feature in a luxury magazine, that the Gangnam house needed a full interior redesign, and had engaged a celebrated designer whose fee was, as she told Soo-yeon with satisfaction, appropriately astronomical. None of these decisions were checked against what was actually in the accounts. The family CFO, a careful man named Mr. Beck who had served the Choi Company for 18 years and had watched the whole unraveling with the helpless horror of a man who can see exactly what is coming but cannot make anyone listen, had requested a meeting with Madame Choi in the spring. He had prepared a presentation. He had charts and projections and a very clear narrative that boiled down to: the business is losing value faster than it is generating it, and the personal spending is making this significantly worse, and if the trajectory does not change within the next 12 months, the consequences will be severe. Madame Choi had listened for approximately 4 minutes before telling him that his projections were too pessimistic and that she had full confidence in Soo-yeon's new strategic direction. She had then excused herself because she had a fitting. Mr. Beck had submitted his resignation 2 weeks later. 3 other senior finance staff had followed him out the door over the following month, the financial equivalent of rats reading the water level. Soo-yeon, meanwhile, had discovered a passion for luxury travel content. She had begun documenting her life for social media with a commitment that required a dedicated content team, a photographer, a videographer, a social media manager, and a stylist for shoots. She posted from private villas in Bali, from yachts in Monaco, from suites in Paris hotels where a single night cost more than the monthly salary of several of her company's remaining employees. The content was beautiful. Her following grew. Brands sent her things. What the content did not show was the state of the business that was funding all of it. By autumn of the second year after Junho's departure, the first major investment had collapsed. A tech venture that Soo-yeon had approved based on a pitch meeting she described as very inspiring energy turned out to have been misrepresenting its user numbers. And when the fraud was uncovered, the investment was written off entirely. It was not, on its own, a fatal blow, but it was the first visible crack in a structure that was already compromised throughout. Then the real estate holdings began to show strain. Several properties that had been managed conservatively under Junho's oversight had been refinanced under Soo-yeon to free up cash that had promptly been redirected into operational expenses and, less visibly, into the lifestyle expenditures that had become the family's baseline. When the refinancing terms came due, the cash was not there to service them. Madame Choi received the first creditor notice on a Tuesday morning. She was in the middle of breakfast, a carefully arranged meal prepared by her private chef, who was flown in 3 times a week from a restaurant in Tokyo because she had decided, after a trip there, that his food suited her digestion better than anyone local. She read the notice, set it aside with a slight frown, and called her lawyer. Her lawyer told her the situation was serious. She told her lawyer to handle it and returned to her breakfast. 2 weeks later, the second notice arrived. Then a third. Then a letter from the bank regarding the company's primary operating account. Then a call from one of the remaining board members, one of the ones Soo-yeon had not yet managed to remove, who used words like insolvency and liability and personal asset exposure that Madam Choi found both alarming and deeply inappropriate for a phone conversation. It was Soo-yeon who finally said the thing out loud, on a November evening in the Gangnam house, sitting across from her mother in the newly redesigned living room with its imported Japanese oak floors and its bespoke lighting fixtures and its carefully curated art collection, several pieces of which had been purchased in the past year at auction. "We need Junho," she said. Madam Choi looked at her daughter for a long moment. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul glittered in the dark, indifferent and magnificent. "Then we will call him," she said. The first call came on a Wednesday. Naledi was in a school in the outskirts of Pietermaritzburg when it happened, sitting in a plastic chair in a classroom painted the particular bright yellow of optimism, watching a group of 9-year-olds take turns reading aloud from books that had arrived as part of the foundation's latest distribution. The child currently reading was a small girl named Thandi who had been identified 3 months ago as severely behind her reading level and who was now, with visible concentration and considerable pride, working her way through a story about a girl who discovers a hidden garden. Thandi read slowly and carefully and occasionally looked up to check that the adults in the room were paying attention, which they were. Naledi's phone buzzed in her bag. She silenced it without looking. It buzzed again. She looked this time, an international number, Korean country code, not one she recognized. She declined it and turned back to Thandi, who had reached a particularly satisfying plot development and was now reading with increased urgency. When she got back to her car an hour later, there were 3 missed calls from the same number and a voicemail. She listened to the voicemail with her window rolled down and the summer heat sitting heavily over the school parking lot. It was Soo-yeon. The voice was carefully constructed, not apologetic exactly, but calibrated in the direction of warmth, reaching for a register of sisterly familiarity that their relationship had never actually possessed. She said she was calling because she had been trying to reach Junho and he was not answering. She said she hoped Naledi was well. She said she would love to speak when Naledi had a moment. She said things were a little complicated at home and she was sure they could work something out as a family. Naledi sat in the hot car and listened to the message twice. Then she forwarded it to Junho with a single line. "Your sister called me." His response came, "Within minutes. I know. She called the office too. I'll handle it." She drove back to the farmhouse thinking about the word family. The way Soo-yeon had used it as a family, as if the word were a key that would open a door that had been locked for good reason. As if family were a claim that superseded everything that had happened, everything that had not been done, every phone call that had gone unanswered in a hospital corridor while a small boy fought for his life. Junho was on a call when she arrived home, sitting at his desk in the study with the door slightly ajar, speaking in Korean in the measured tone he used when he was dealing with something that required patience he was not entirely feeling. She made tea and sat on the stoop and watched the garden and waited. He came out 20 minutes later and sat beside her. "That was my mother's lawyer," he said. "Not your mother herself." "No." He accepted the tea she poured for him. "Apparently she is not yet at the stage of calling personally." She sent the lawyer to explain the situation and request a. He used the phrase family consultation. "What did you say?" "I said I would need to see the full financial picture before any conversation could take place." He paused. "He sent it over while we were talking. I've been through the headlines." Naledi looked at him. "How bad?" He was quiet for a moment. "The company has lost approximately 60% of its operating value in 2 years. 3 major investment failures. Significant debt against the property portfolio. The personal expenditures." He stopped, chose his words. "My mother spent more on her wardrobe in the past 18 months than we spent building this house." Soo-yeon has been running content trips to Maldives and Tuscany and Santorini with a production team of 7 people, all charged to the company accounts. The interior redesign of the house cost. He named a figure that made Naledi briefly close her eyes. "That is separate from the Swiss clinic bills and the Tokyo chef." The garden was quiet in the afternoon heat. A bird was doing something repetitive and insistent in the thorn tree near the back fence. "What do they want from you?" Naledi asked. "Capital injection. My name back on the business. My signature on the restructuring documents." Essentially, they want me to come back and clean up what they made. He drank his tea. The lawyer was careful not to use the word rescue, but that is what it was. And the house? The Gangnam house. It's been mortgaged. Twice. If the debt isn't serviced in the next quarter, the bank begins recovery proceedings. He paused. The Hermes room will not save them. Something complicated moved across Nality's face. She was quiet for a moment, watching the garden, thinking about a hospital corridor and a phone that rang 6 times before being answered. Thinking about a party and a birthday and the words, "You are a capable woman. Handle it." Thinking about gold bangles from her mother's wrists, sold on a Tuesday morning to keep a man's son alive. A man whose family had decided she was not suitable to be in the room. "What are you thinking?" Junho asked. "I'm thinking about Liam," she said simply. He nodded. He was thinking about Liam too. He always was. "I am not going to rescue them," he said. "I want you to know that is my decision before I ask what you think. I am not going to give them access to capital or put my name back on anything. That is not something I am willing to do. I wasn't going to ask you to. I know." He put the mug down. "But I wanted to say it clearly. So you knew I was not going to be swayed by—" He searched for the right word. "By obligation. By the idea that blood means I owe them something regardless of what they did." Nality turned to look at him. At this man who had chosen her across every barrier, who had woken up from a coma and the first coherent thing he had done was apologize and the second was restructure their finances, who had learned Zulu and grown tomatoes and sat on this deck every Sunday and remembered their son out loud because grief deserved a voice. "Okay," she said. "Suyun will call again," he said. "Let her. My mother will call eventually, when she has run out of intermediaries." "Let her call," Nality said. Her voice was not hard. It was something quieter and more final than hardness. It was the voice of a woman who had finished performing reactions for people who had never deserved them. "We will be polite. We will be decent. And we will not give them what they want." Junho looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. The calls came in waves after that. Suyun called Nality's number twice more before apparently accepting that this route was not productive. A cousin called Junho, a manha had not spoken to in years, suddenly warm and familiar, using childhood nicknames. The lawyer called twice more with increasingly detailed presentations of the financial crisis, as if more information would change the answer. An old business associate of the family called under the pretense of reconnecting and spent 40 minutes working around to the subject before Junho said, pleasantly and clearly, that he was not in a position to assist and wished him a good day. Then, on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks after the first call, while Nality was making dinner and Junho was in the garden arguing gently with a pepper plant, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. He stood very still for a moment. Then he came inside and held it up for Nality to see. Imianim, the Korean word for mother, still saved under that name after everything. She met his eyes. She nodded once. He answered. The call with Madame Choi lasted 23 minutes. Nality did not listen from the other room. She respected the privacy of it, had always understood that whatever reckoning was necessary between Junho and his mother was his to have, not hers to witness or supervise or extract satisfaction from. She finished making dinner. She set the table. She heard his voice from the lounge, low and even, the occasional pause that meant he was listening, the occasional Korean phrase delivered with a finality that communicated clearly even without translation. When he came to the kitchen doorway, his face was composed, not entirely unmarked by the conversation. There was something around his eyes that spoke of the particular tiredness that comes from long postponed truths finally being said, but composed, decided. She asked me to come back, he said, not just to help with the business, to come back, to bring you. He paused. She said. He stopped, started again. She said she had made mistakes in how she treated you, that she recognized this now. Nality looked up from the pot on the stove. Did she apologize? A long pause. She said she recognized she had made mistakes. That's not an apology. No, he agreed. It is not. Nality stirred the pot. The kitchen smelled of garlic and tomatoes. His tomatoes from the garden. The ones that had finally started producing after her mother's intervention. The ones he was irrationally proud of. What did you tell her? I told her I wished her well, Junho said. I told her that I hoped she and Suyun would find a way through this. I told her there were good advisors available to them if they chose to engage them honestly. And I told her that I would not be returning to Seoul, and that I would not be providing financial support, and that this was a final decision. How did she receive that? She was quiet for a long time. He came to stand beside her at the stove. Then she said that she had only ever wanted the best for me. I told her that I believed she believed that, and I told her that what she had called wanting the best had cost us our son. The kitchen was very still. She didn't respond to that? Naledi asked softly. She cried, he said, simply, without satisfaction, without cruelty. Just the fact of it. Naledi put the spoon down and turned to him and put her arms around him and felt him breathe. Felt the full weight of 23 minutes of necessary truth settle into his shoulders and then, slowly, begin to release. You did the right thing, she said. I know, he said into her hair. It still hurts. It's supposed to, she said. It would only not hurt if you didn't love him. And you did. You do. He held her for a moment longer. Then he stepped back and looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand over 7 years. The one that meant he was about to say something important that he had been preparing for a while. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me. I want you to know that the life we have here, this house, this garden, the foundation, Sunday mornings, your mother telling me I'm watering things wrong. He paused. The corner of his mouth moved. This is the best I have ever been. This is the first time in my adult life that I have felt like I was living in the right direction. And I know that is not a small thing to say. I know what it cost to get here. I know what you gave to get here. She looked at him. I know I can't give back what you sold, he continued. I know I can't give back the bangles or the time or the 3 years of being made to feel like you were less than you were. I can't give back Liam. His voice held steady on the last sentence with the effort of a man who had practiced it. But I want you to know that I see it. All of it. What you gave. What you carried. What you never asked to be carried and carried anyway. Naledi was quiet for a moment. I know you see it, she said finally. Good. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back. A gesture so familiar and so gentle it made her chest ache in a way that was not grief but was adjacent to it. Now let's eat these tomatoes before I get too emotional about them. She laughed. She laughed the full version, the one that used her whole face. In Seoul, the Choi family home in Gangnam was entered by bank representatives on a cold December morning, while Madame Choi sat in its newly redesigned living room in a Chanel suit that was, technically, still hers for another 48 hours before the asset seizure was formalized. She had dressed carefully for this day. She was not entirely sure why, perhaps because appearance was the language she had always spoken, the last vocabulary available to her when all the others had run out. The Hermes room was catalogued by the assessors with a thoroughness she found deeply humiliating. Each bag removed from its dust bag, photographed, logged. The shoes, the jewelry, the art collection from the walls. The Japanese oak floors would remain, you could not remove floors, but almost everything that had been placed upon them was now subject to recovery. The Swiss clinic treatments were non-recoverable. The Tokyo chef's flights and fees were non-recoverable. The content trips to Bali and Monaco and Santorini, the photographs of which still lived on Soo-Yun's social media feeds, glowing and curated and entirely removed from the reality of their financing, were non-recoverable. Soo-Yun had cried for 3 days when the full extent of the situation became undeniable. She had then, with characteristic energy, pivoted to viewing the whole thing as content. There was, she had read, a considerable audience for luxury to simplicity transition stories, before her management team pointed out that her contractual obligations to several brands were now complicated by the legal proceedings, and she had cried again. The house was sold at auction in February. It was purchased by a young tech entrepreneur who planned to demolish and rebuild. Madame Choi moved into a significantly smaller apartment in a less prestigious area of the city with Soo-Yun, who was in the process of understanding, for the first time in her adult life, what it meant to pay for things yourself. The adjustment was not smooth. The adjustment was, if one was being honest, quite painful. The designer clothes were sold through consignment, not by choice but by necessity, piece by piece, the Chanels and the Diors and the Valentinos cycling through the second-hand luxury market that Madame Choi had always considered beneath her. There was a particular irony to this that she was aware of and did not discuss. The Hermes collection fetched good money at auction. Not enough but good. She did not call Jun-ho again. She had her pride, and it was, at this point, the last significant asset she possessed that had not been assessed and logged and recovered. In the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands, spring arrived the way it always did, suddenly, generously, as if the hills had been waiting all along. The lavender along the farmhouse path came up first, then the indigenous grasses, then the vegetable patch in a riot of unexpected productivity that vindicated, Junho pointed out, every single decision he had made about the soil preparation. Naledi's mother was visiting for 2 weeks and had taken over the kitchen with the calm authority of a woman who considers your kitchen to be temporarily hers whenever she is present, which Junho had accepted with what Naledi considered admirable grace. Liam's Light had been featured in a national education publication. The Department of Basic Education Partnership had been formalized. They were expanding to Limpopo in the autumn, and a foundation from the Netherlands had made contact about a potential collaboration. Naledi had a meeting in Pretoria on Thursday and had already prepared for it with the focused excitement of someone who is doing the thing they were built to do. On Sunday morning they sat on the deck with their tea, as they always did. "Your turn or mine?" Junho asked. "Mine," Naledi said. She wrapped both hands around her mug, thought for a moment, smiled. "Do you remember when he tried to make breakfast for us for your birthday? He must have been 8. He made toast and completely burnt it and then spent 20 minutes trying to scrape the black parts off before we came downstairs. And by the time he called us down, the toast was basically just a thin wafer of bread and he presented it like it was a 5-star meal." Junho's face went through several things, landed on a smile that was warm and broken and real all at once. "He put a paper doily under it," he said. "He put a paper doily under it," she confirmed. "Where he even found a paper doily I never knew. He was very proud of that doily. He was extremely proud of that doily." They sat together in the morning light, two people who had lost enormous things and built real ones, who had been tested in ways that leave permanent marks and had come out the other side not unmarked but unbroken. The garden stretched out before them, lavender and wild grass and tomatoes and Mike too in his terracotta pot, thriving beyond all reasonable expectation. The hills rolled out beyond the garden fence, green and quiet and entirely indifferent to anything that had happened in a Gangnam living room or a Seoul hospital or a cold December apartment where a woman sat in a Chanel suit watching assessors catalog what remained of a life built on the wrong foundations. Here, the foundations were different. Here, the foundations were love freely given, work that mattered, a son remembered out loud every Sunday, a man who had learned Zulu and grown tomatoes and apologized for the right things, and a woman who had come home to herself so completely that she sometimes marveled at how long she had survived being away. The tea cooled. The morning birds started up. Somewhere in the kitchen, her mother was beginning breakfast with the efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that love was a verb and cooking was one of its primary conjugations. Between two worlds, they had found the only one that mattered. It was here. It had always been here. It had simply been waiting for them to arrive.
Hi guys, in this story we learned that a woman of color walked into a family that decided before she opened her mouth that she was not enough. She loved them anyway. She sacrificed everything for them anyway. She buried her son and stood up anyway. She built something beautiful anyway. And in the end, she did not need their acceptance to know her own worth. She never did. The tragedy was never that they didn't see her. The tragedy was that they missed out on someone extraordinary because they were too blind to look. Kindly like and subscribe.